Hello, I'm glad you've joined us again today as we continue our study of the Gospel of Mark. We're looking at the crucifixion of Jesus. Last time in our study we looked at Jesus before Pilate, and where Pilate unjustly gave in to the Jewish leaders to pacify them, gave Jesus over to be crucified. We saw how the soldiers abused and mocked Jesus and then led him out toward crucifixion. Today we pick up in chapter 15 in verse 21 where it says, "And they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. And they tried to give him mixed wine with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him, and the inscription and the charge against him read, King of the Jews. And they crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, And he was numbered with the transgressors. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads, saying, Ha, you going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself and come down from the cross. And in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking him among themselves, saying, He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. And those who were crucified with him were casting the same insults at him. The story of Jesus' crucifixion is told in all four Gospels. Mark's account is, of course, the shortest. Slightly longer is Matthew's account. Luke's is twice the length of Mark's. John is about the same as Matthew's, but gives different details. John tells us that Jesus first started out bearing his own cross, and then we're told here that Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry Jesus' cross, possibly because of Jesus' weakened condition. Paul, in his letter to the Romans chapter 16, verse 13, writes a greeting to Rufus, which is mentioned here that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. If these are the same, we see that this incident had a great impact upon this man. Verse 22, it says they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. Golgotha is basically the Aramaic term for a place of a skull. The Greek word is the word we get the word cranium from. Later, Jerome's Latin version of the Bible translated Calvary. Usually when we think of Calvary, we think of the place of crucifixion. But it's simply the word that means place of a skull. Now, whether the place looks like a skull, there's a place outside of Jerusalem that resembles a skull, whether it's that place or it was a place where there were skulls because of where people were executed, we simply don't know. But it was according to the law that they were to have capital crimes outside the city of Jerusalem. Mark 15 and verse 23 there says they offered him wine flavored with myrrh, but Jesus refuses it. This is probably a drugged wine. Jesus faces the cross with a clear head. He has things he's going to say, and the things he faces, he's going to face them with a clear head so that he might set the perfect example for us and be the perfect substitute. Mark 15 verse 24 simply says they crucified him. Those three words are so vivid and yet so significant. He didn't go into the details about all the things that are involved in crucifixion. I think one of the proofs of inspiration is the brevity in which these gospel writers wrote. And certainly they wanted to say much more, but God directed them to say just what they said. Men by themselves don't write that way. volumes have been written about the things that they told. Mark simply says they crucified him, and they would be the soldiers. This was a terrible death designed for terrible people. Those who have been convicted of the most gross crimes. It's been said that a person who was crucified died 1,000 deaths. Large nails were driven through the hands and the feet, and they were suspended there on that cross, hanging from those nails. And most people who died from crucifixion died from suffocation because they couldn't breathe. Could no longer, to breathe, you had to pull up by the hands and push on the feet to be able to breathe. Later we'll see that they want to break the legs of the ones who are still living so that they would go on and die. Terrible, terrible death, hard on the body, loss of blood, throbbing headache, burning thirst, all these things. But the emphasis should really not be placed upon the physical torture of Jesus as much as the spiritual things that he endured. Jesus had been with God. He was God, the eternal, and he knew the glory of heaven, and now he experiences the most terrifying death here upon the cross. Having been crucified, his clothes were divided among the soldiers. It was customary for the soldiers to divide the belongings of the criminals, to cast lots for them. They, instead of tearing the seamless tunic that Jesus would have worn, they cast lots for it, this fulfilling the prophecy of Psalm 22 and verse 18. You see the indifference of these soldiers. They've crucified Jesus. They've crucified these other men. No doubt many of them had seen this and participated in this before. They're just doing what they do, and they're not really paying much attention to it. But there's at least one of them, a centurion, that we'll look at it a little further here in verse 39, who is in these things are making a deep impression upon him. But Mark says it was the 3rd hour in which they crucified him. By Roman time, this would be 9 o'clock in the morning. And Jesus would hang there on the cross in pain and suffering and in shame for the rest of the day. Verse 26, over his head is placed the indictment against him, that he was the king of the Jews. John tells us that when Pilate had this written, it was written in Hebrew and Latin and in Greek, so all could read it and all could see it. When he put king of the Jews, that was why he was being crucified. The chief priests didn't like that. They wanted him to change it and say that he said that he was the king of the Jews. But Pilate said, I have written what I've written, and maybe he purposely did that to show that he didn't believe the charge that they'd brought against him. And he did this kind of as a dig to the Jewish leaders. 2 robbers were crucified with Jesus, one on either side of him, and this fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 12 and following, where he was reckoned with the transgressors. This was being fulfilled, something that would these passages, Psalms been written 1,000 years before this took place, and Isaiah written 750 years before, but they were taking place in detail. Verse 29 says the passers-by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads, saying, you said you was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Come down from the cross. They were mocking him, saying he saved others, but he can't save himself. They were taunting him to come down from the cross. And Jesus could have. He'd already told Peter that he had the power to call down 12 legions of angels. He could have just fought it, and it would have happened. It could all ended, but it was not his will, but the Father's will, his eternal plan, the only plan that could save man, and he stayed on the cross and took the abuse. They'd accused him of blasphemy. and yet they were the ones who were guilty of blasphemy as they cursed and mocked the very Son of God. Verse 32 says they were heaping insults upon him. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23, it says, while being reviled, and reviled is to have insults and abuse hurled at you. It says, while being reviled, he reviled not in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he done that for our sakes, and does that as an example, Peter says, that we are to humble ourselves. And verse 33, it says, the 6th hour had come, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. In the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And when some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, behold, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave him a drink, saying, let us see if Elijah will take him down. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly this was the Son of God. It was now the 6th hour. 12 p.m. since Jesus had been put on the cross. Jesus hanging there by his hands and his feet, suffering and pain and shame for 3 long hours, and darkness falls upon the land. And for 3 more gruesome hours, till 3 p.m., Jesus hangs there, and then he cries out in Aramaic, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Out of all the things that Jesus faced, the hardest was to have the Father to turn his back on him and let him die. The one whom he was totally united with, the one whom he had been with from eternity. The only one who really understood him, turned his back on him and let him die. But this was the eternal plan. This is what Jesus had submitted to. Is the only plan that could save man. But it hurt him so deeply to have and to allow the Father to do this. John tells us he said, I thirst. No doubt he did. The blood loss, hanging there in such pain. Psalm 22 and verse 15 foretold of this, where it said, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, my tongue cleaves to my jaw, thou dost lay me in the dust of death. And immediately someone, no doubt a soldier acting under the order of the centurion, took a sponge, filled it with sour wine and vinegar, a cheap wine that the soldiers drank that was good for quenching thirst, put on a sponge, on a stick, brought to his mouth. Why do they have a sponge? Some have suggested in the kit of the soldiers they had a sponge. It was part of their toiletry for cleaning themselves that they would take with them. Anyway, a sponge was taken and filled with sour wine and put to the mouth of Jesus. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. The temple veil was torn from top to bottom. And when the centurion saw this, he said, surely this was the Son of God. He was standing right there in front of him when he said this and died. It's clear from his last words there. Jesus is recorded as saying in John 19 in verse 30, it is finished. Meaning that his work, which he had come to do, to accomplish the Father's will, was done. It was not a cry of defeat, a cry of victory. And he gave up his spirit. He committed his spirit into the Father, and he died. He died at his will. Certainly the centurion had seen many people die, but no one ever died like this. The old covenant was then fulfilled, and the new covenant was established by the death of Jesus. The old covenant was nailed to the cross, as Paul would say in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14. The new covenant had been ratified by the perfect sacrifice. And symbolically, God tore the veil of the temple, which stood as a barrier between God and man, a barrier to the Holy of Holies, to the presence of God. Now it was torn. It was opened up. Jesus had provided unto God. And this was an act of God, tearing this veil. It was torn. Notice it says from top to bottom. It wasn't torn by man from bottom to top. But God had done this symbolically to show that access to him had been provided. Again, the centurion, seeing how Jesus had conducted himself in the midst of all this wickedness and taunts and mockeries, now there was this loud cry, a cry of confidence, a cry that means Jesus voluntarily surrendered himself and calls upon the Father. No doubt he'd heard the Jewish leaders speaking among themselves, scoffing at Jesus about being the Son of God. And besides all this, he sees the effects of nature, the darkness that's come upon the earth. And as we read in the accounts of Matthew, the earthquake, the splitting of the rocks at the death of Jesus. All this combined makes a great impression on this centurion. And he comes to the obvious conclusion that this was the Son of God. And he was the Son of God who was crucified for our sakes. A lot to consider in this. Our time's gone. Next time we'll pick up there with the burial of Jesus. And until then, I hope you have a good day.